Do today, the last day of the year. Oh, yeah, the course evaluation. Right? So what we're going to be talking about to close things out is the phenomenon of moral panics. I used to talk about moral panics a little bit earlier in the semester, but it's a really good way, I think, to end the class. It's a really good way to end the class because it brings a few different ideas, concepts, and notions together because it is extending, in a sense, the thing we talked about on Tuesday. I mean, it's different, but it's along the same line, in the sense that we're not talking about the breaking of laws so much as we're talking about society's reaction to the breaking of law. And maybe the most famous type of society's reaction to the breaking of law is what's called a moral panic. There are a lot of different terms that we can use to describe moral mechanics. There are things that are like related to moral mechanics. And maybe like sociologists will make distinctions between like a moral mechanic, say, and an urban legend. I think they're different. I would describe them as different. Moral mechanic is different from an urban legend. But the Venn diagram of moral mechanics and urban legends does have some overlap. And maybe one of those elements or types or examples of overlap is like razor blades and Halloween candy. This was a big deal in the 1980s in particular, but it seems to have kind of still persisted to this day. This was a study that was done by Joel Best. He is at the University of Delaware currently. I believe he might be retired now, but he did this really interesting study. I read it as an undergrad. Actually, feel free to read this on your own. It's a really interesting study. He looks at actual incidents of this happening based on news stories, and it's so inherently rare. So inordinately rare over several decades. Only a handful of instances did this even happen. And it was, seems to be targeted, it seems to be highly unusual, but yet the idea of mixed razor blades and Halloween candy sort of emerged as this kind of cultural phenomenon, such that even now, like Halloween comes around, and why people still like look at the candy?
Mm-mm.
Yeah. So it doesn't like this thing really happens all that often. Yeah. But yet it seems to work its way into our cultural, I don't know, our cultural sensitivity, our cultural sense. Which I think is really interesting. I think it's interesting that it's a kind of anticipatory crime, the anticipation related to crime that never actually transpires. We've never found race, for example, we've never found a drug in a Halloween game. Um, and it's not something that just happens. This is a really interesting study, and it really helps highlight, I think, a really important point that we we touched on a little bit here and there, but I want to make really clear, and that is what people perceive when it comes to crime. What people perceive when it comes to crime is very different than the reality. What people's perceptions. It's just like potential offenders who've experienced, say, being caught in fire are really bad about calculating the odds, like being caught again. Human beings in general are really bad at calculating. What human beings are also really bad at is figuring out how much crime there is. We've been asking people using national representative studies how much crime is out there and how much crime is a problem and if it's increasing. We've been asking people that for a very long time. And it's always increasing, according to public perception. It's always on the rise, and it rarely is on the rise. In fact, we've seen the study declines that we've talked about. So people's perceptions are often off. But what happens when those perceptions kind of get enshrined into law? And that's what's important for the concept of canon. The idea of the moral canon emerged from a British sociologist named Stanley Cohen in the 1970s. He articulated it in a book that was very, very famous called Coelho's Moral Panic. Came out in 1972. And this is what Stanley Cohen describes a moral panic as. Okay. In a moral panic, a condition in which a person or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to social values of nature. Its nature is presented in a stylized, stereotypical fashion by the mass media. Moral barricades are made by editors, bishops, politicians, and other right-thinking people. Socially accredited experts pronounce the diagnoses and solutions. So it's sort of this thing that happens, this social event that happens that all different types of people can contribute to. He came across this phenomenon and coined the term volcanics and sort of corresponding by basically observing what happened in this small British seaside town in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Basically, what happened was, coincidentally, a couple of I don't even want to say gangs. That's not exactly accurate. Groups of youths were kind of outsiders, and I guess they were on scooters or something, and they were countercultural, but in different ways. There was all the Mods and the Rockers who were two different. They were kind of different shapes of outsiders. And then there was some minor scuffles in this town. Um, Maybe some mild vandalism and some fights broke out here and there. And it became this huge thing. The media descended on the town, and he was just happened to be there, and he happened to watch all of this transpire. And so, and it became seriously about out of mold. It became something that it wasn't. And everybody contributed to it. It was this trend. It was this social consciousness that was moving and that was impossible to stop. And then it was gone. Then it was gone. Almost as quickly as it came, the panic disappeared, the kids left, and the media went away, and that was it. And things went back exactly the way they were before. He was like, that's bizarre, that's interesting. And so he's coined this term moral panic course. And this is basically what it means. We're going to break down what the concept means and how we would understand it theoretically today. Because again, it's a really interesting social phenomenon that still happens now all the time. Maybe a little bit differently, especially in the era of social media, but it still is something that emerges fairly frequently. And maybe we'll have some examples that we can talk about. So what makes a moral panic a panic rather than just panic? What makes it a moral panic? A moral panic is a moral panic because it is directed at a group. So directed at a group of people. Again, it's a highly social phenomenon. It's just a kind of general experience of fear and anxiety. Instead, it's a targeted feeling of hostility and anger and fear toward a group of people that are viewed as generally speaking immoral. A group of people that are generally perceived as a problem in a moral sense. That's why it's called a moral panic. This group of people that's identified as the kind of moral problem are what Stanley Cohen calls the folk devils. The folk devils is this category, and every moral panic, in fact, it's a necessary condition. If it doesn't have a folk devil, it's not a moral panic. If it doesn't have a folk devil, it's not a moral panic. A moral panic means that it is a necessary condition to have a moral panic considered. So a folk devil, or a group of folk devils, is a category of people who presumably engage in some kind of practices that's perceived as undoubtedly, clearly, obviously wrong and evil and immoral. They fundamentally threaten the core values of the community or of the society, of the nation, whatever. It's a group of people that's identified as a threat, a moral threat. They demonstrate a threat to the key values that we hold sacred. I mentioned sacred. I talked about what is sacred. Well, you can see throughout this concept, as we'll get into. The term panic refers to something that is disproportionate. It's something that is that's not rational, and that's not clearly in line with maybe the extent or the severity of the threat. So there is a kind of panic component to it. That's why it's called a moral panic. So it's moral in the sense that it's a folk devil who are perceived to be engaged in moral activities, and then you have the panic part, which demonstrates a kind of irrationality and disproportionality. There is a delusional component to moral panic. Because they're panics, they're disproportionate. They're outside of the realm of what is, under normal circumstances, an appropriate response. And what fuels the moral panic is this sense of delusion, in a sense, the sense of disproportionality with regard to the threat that is in place, how salient, how important the threat is, and what the consequences of the threat are going to be. But again, once you start the moral panic, it's really difficult to stop it. It's really difficult to shout it down. It's basically impossible for rational minds to stop the moral panic. The language of a moral panic is one of disaster. So there's a disaster component to it, there's a delusion component to it, but there's also an ambiguity component to it. It's a dimension of ambiguity that compromises the extent to which people can think rationally about the folk devils in the situation. Okay? You need the ambiguity. If you had clarity, if you had detail, you wouldn't necessarily be panicked about it. There's a kind of mystery that keeps it going. It needs that ambiguity in order to kind of cool the fire a little. How to address the problem as a result of this ambiguity is often unclear. What we're supposed to do is unclear. But what is clear is the sense that's shared among people that we have to do something. What that is, there could be a million different perspectives, but something needs to be done. Typically, that something means social control. Typically, that something means we have to do something in the realm of law. We have to do something in the realm of like community activism. We have to mobilize the justice system, perhaps. So something needs to be done, and there can be all different kinds of debates. Comment on like what this means and what we're supposed to do. But where there is consensus, where there is agreement that something is amiss, the folk devils pose a moral problem that needs to be dealt with in some way. What specifically that means, it's often that ambiguity that makes that unclear. So moral panics can be about anything. Moral panics can be about anything. They all kind of share, though, the same underlying structure. To an extent. I think human beings have asked that. Sort of time. They can be about anything. The same pattern can be observed across different types of moral panics, about different things, and about different groups of open. We can still see the same kinds of patterns repeated over and over and over. Moral panics can generally, at least the way that Stanley Cohen described them, emerge out in small groups of people. But that's not necessarily the case. Stanley Cohen didn't anticipate the rise of like social media. Maybe there's an argument to be said that that moral panics are becoming more widespread, they're becoming more globalized. The community that shares in the moral panic could be one that is more extensive and that includes more people than simply a small British seaside town, for example. So as a result, they may include society at large. Maybe that's a very tactile question. Like, are moral panics becoming more globalized? Are they becoming more shared? They obviously still have them, but it's not like they're as local, perhaps, as they were before, because of information sharing and the ease with which that happens. So the folk devil presents a crisis. Something has to be done. But as I noted, what specifically that means is often unclear. There's agreement that something needs to be done. There's agreement about the evilness and the wrongfulness of the moral panics, but there's often not agreement. There's often quite a bit of disagreement, discord about what should be done. What specifically the policy preferences and the policy response should look like. That's where there tends to be much less consensus and much more common. But again, where there is agreement is that the folk devils are a problem and something has to be done about it. It's emotional, it's not rational. It's associated with this fear and anger and hostility that again, it can be quite a bit removed from the reality of the situation. It can be quite a bit removed from the proportionality of the threat and of the harm done, that sort of thing. So it's clear is that it's emotion driven. What's clear is that there's anger and hostility directed towards this big necessary component of the moral panic. There's agreement there, there's consensus there, but there's disagreement about what's safe. There's disagreement about what should be done as. But in general, what people oftentimes clamor for is more social control, more control. You can contain this thing. You can make it go away. the way to contain things and make them go away is by engaging mechanisms